Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have the Rhode Island vampire. In the late 1800s, tuberculosis was spreading rapidly in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont. This obviously would have been pretty terrifying for the residents of these places, but things quickly took a very dark turn. Since many of the people who were passing away from this illness appeared very obviously ill with sunken, drained faces, for some reason the logical response was that people believed they had been the prey of vampires. There was a family in Exeter, Rhode Island that had multiple people pass away from the illness, so then people believed that someone in the family must be feeding the vampire. They even went as far as to exhume the bodies of some of the deceased family members to make sure that they weren't undead. One of the exhumed bodies had passed away more recently, so her body was in a better condition, which people of course took as a sign of her being a vampire. This led them to burn her heart and liver and then mix the ashes with water. This is most definitely a crime today, and pretty scary, but to make things even worse, they gave this concoction to other people in the town who had fallen ill as some kind of a cure. Imagine having to drink that and then still having tuberculosis after. Definitely not a good trade-off. In our number 9 spot today we have the history of dentures. Personally, I don't have a ton of experience with dentures, but they seem to be a pretty straightforward thing these days, aside from the cost of dental, of course. But things weren't always the way that they are today. Instead of dentures being made of fake teeth before, they used to be made with real human teeth, which is absolutely disgusting. After the Battle of Waterloo, scavengers went and took the teeth off of corpses, which is quite a job, and then they sold these teeth to dentists. The dentists would boil the teeth, chop the roots off, and then attach these teeth to ivory base plates and then sell them to customers. Aside from this being an extremely morally questionable practice in its entirety, it's also just very creepy. In our number 8 spot today we have the smallpox spread. I'm sure at some point or another most of us learned about smallpox and the epidemic, which is something that we luckily don't really have to worry about much anymore, but one thing a lot of people explained that they didn't know was how badly it devastated indigenous peoples. Europeans who came over to America brought with them a multitude of diseases that they would have had some immunity to, considering it was likely their bodies had encountered it before. But this was not the case for those already living on the land that is now referred to as North America. Indigenous Americans not only had no immunity towards this disease, but also the traditional ways of treating illness may have only exacerbated the symptoms. Because, of course, how could you possibly know how to treat something that you've literally never seen before and with no help from the people who do actually know how? It has been estimated that the spread of disease caused the population of Indigenous Americans to decline by 70%. There is a theory that this spread of disease may have been one of the only things that led to the colonization of North America. In our number 7 spot today we have the Tulsa riot. This event occurred on May 31st and June 1st of 1921, and it has actually been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. This happened in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and basically just mobs of white racist people went out and attacked black residents and businesses. What started this was when a 19-year-old black man named Dick Rowland was accused of harming a white girl, and he was subsequently arrested, and there were rumors that he was going to be lynched. This of course drew a bunch of racist white people out of their homes to participate, but then a group of around 75 black men showed up to make sure that he didn't get lynched. One thing led to another, and a firefight broke out that led to 10 of the white people and 2 of the black people being killed. After this, all hell broke loose. In 2020, the last living survivor of the massacre, R&B and jazz saxophonist Hal Singer, a total legend, passed away at the age of 100. In the same year, this massacre finally became a part of the Oklahoma State curriculum, and it's about time, only a century too late. In our number 6 spot today we have Heraclitus of Ephesus. Heraclitus was an ancient Greek philosopher who helped push the notion that the universe is in constant change, as well as the unity of opposites, where the universe is a system of balance exchanges. This is all fine and well, but where things get a little troublesome is in his own personal life. You see, the thing is that he was a misanthrope, and his dislike for humankind led him to having long stretches where he was quite isolated. He would wander through the wilderness alone, surviving on plants and other things that he could scavenge. In the end, he came down with a pretty terrible and painful illness called dropsy, which is an accumulation of fluid underneath the skin. Doctors were unfortunately unable to help him, so he took matters into into his own hands. He decided to cover himself in cow dung under the belief that as it dried, it would draw the moisture out from under his skin. This could have been a genius idea, albeit super gross, but things took a very, very dark turn. Covered in the dung, he laid out in the sun to dry, but the dung created a body cast and left him unable to move. This inability to move also left him unable to shoo off the pack of wild dogs that ended up surrounding him, so unfortunately he was eaten alive. I guess I can understand why this one may have been left out of history class. In our number 5 spot today, we have the internment camps. During World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which would cause 117,000 Japanese Americans to have to give up their homes, jobs, and businesses and move to internment camps. This was due to the fear of espionage after Pearl Harbor. This was truly one of the worst violations of civil rights in the 20th century, and the government didn't apologize for it until decades later, but they cited national security as the justification for their actions. Unfortunately, this was only the beginning, as other countries began to follow suit, with Canada, Mexico, Peru, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina all having their own versions of this same kind of atrocity. It is very surprising to me that this isn't something that is discussed more often, as it is of course something that would prove detrimental to the Japanese American community for decades to come. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. New York City's Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in 1911 was an unbelievably terrible incident that led to changes being made for factory workers in America. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was located on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of a building in Greenwich Village, and it of course was where shirtwaists were made, which we would now call a woman's blouse. I call this place a factory, but it was definitely more like a sweatshop, and the employees were mostly comprised of young women. So, like I mentioned before, in 1911 there was unfortunately a fire that broke out on the 8th floor, and because of the very cramped and unsafe working conditions, the fire ended up claiming the lives of 146 people that day. After more details came out about the incident and how the terrible working conditions were mostly to blame for the amount of lives that were lost, protests broke out all around the city. People began demanding better for the women who had to work in these kinds of places. Like, just as an example, the doors to the stairwells and exits were locked so that employees couldn't take unauthorized breaks. How unbelievable is that? And the worst part is that the owners of the company, who were largely responsible for what happened that day, basically just got off scot-free. If you want to know more about this fateful day, the amazing podcast My Favorite Murder by Georgia Hardstark and Karen Kilgariff has an episode that does a wonderful job covering it. In our number 3 spot today, we have Bikini Island. Bikini Island is located within the Marshall Islands, and it was once the home to around 170 islanders. In 1940, the US president at the time, Harry Truman, ordered that the military test their nuclear weapons in the case of a future where they would be deemed necessary, since World War II had just ended and people were of course feeling concerned about what the future would hold. Since Bikini was located in a place where ships and planes don't normally travel very close to, unfortunately it was the spot chosen for this testing site. The residents of the island were asked to vacate, quote, for the good of mankind and to end all world wars, to which they of course obliged under the impression that they would one day be able to move back. After this, the testing began, and in 1954 the US military detonated Castle Bravo, which is one of the most powerful weapons at 15 megatons. There were 22 other weapons that were detonated on this island as well, so it's safe to say this place got a ton of nuclear activity, which left it with extremely high levels of radiation. This left residents unable to return for much longer than anticipated, with the first returning in the 70s. But of course, shortly after these poor people moved back, they realized that the island still had totally unsafe levels of radiation, making it still unfit to live on, which has left it still uninhabited. In our number 2 spot today, we have strange medicine. It's not necessarily uncommon for us to hear about strange things that people in the past used to do, but sometimes those strange things are also disgusting. It was extremely common in the past for people to use human remains as a form of medicine. These gruesome treatments would consist of things such as blood, ground up human skull, and even human fat. Tomb raiders would even steal remains in order for them to be sold to the wealthy, which is incredibly dark and apparently mummy remains were the ideal remains for these sorts of things, which then led to a shortage of mummies. Never thought I'd be in a position where I'd be talking about a shortage of mummies, but truly anything can happen over here on Bumblebee. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have a sticky situation. Okay, so this one is less of an event, more of just a historical invention that absolutely should not have existed, and that is the sticky bomb. After the British hurriedly evacuated France in 1940, they were facing the threat of German invasion and had come up with some weapons that could be used against tanks. Thus, the sticky grenade or sticky bomb was born. It was formally called the anti-tank hand grenade number 74, and basically the design was that there was a metal outer shell that covered a bomb coated in adhesive. The idea was to have the user pull a pin to remove the metal casing, where they could then run up to a tank, use the sticky adhesive to stick it to the tank, activate the 5-second fuse, and get the heck out of there. Or they could just throw it and hope it stuck. Well, there's a few problems with this design. The first one that I'm sure all of us can understand is that the adhesive didn't want to stick to anything dusty or wet or muddy, which are all things that happen to be common on tanks. You know what they did like to stick to though? Human skin. Unfortunately, this invention could prove much more detrimental to the person who was attempting to use it. Despite these very obvious and dangerous flaws, it was still used by a few different armed forces, but I don't think anyone has used it in recent history, which is truthfully probably for the best.
Number 10. Ancient Mayan turkey worship. A lot of words there. Turkeys play a significant role in ancient Mayan culture, both as a source of food and feathers for clothing and decoration. If you were a turkey, you were screwed really in any department. Turkeys were domesticated by indigenous peoples in Mexico and Central America over 2,000 years ago, and their use and importance grew over time. It varies, and sometimes it looks like we're going to worship a turkey and we have to talk about it. The Mayans also believed in animal symbolism and incorporated it into their religious beliefs. That's why we can sometimes say that they worshipped turkeys. Now, there's no record of turkeys being worshipped as deities, but that's a hot rumor. It's really a fib, but you'll hear that time to time. Turkeys are turkeys, they're not deities, they're just, I don't know, they're yummy, they're delicious, depending on if you like to eat them. Turkeys, yeah. They're deities, the more you know. Number 9. Horse priest. Caligula. Let's talk about this fella. He was a Roman emperor who ruled from 37 to 41 CE. Now, he was known for his erratic behavior, of course, given what I'm about to say, including his decision to make his horse a priest. His horse a priest. I don't know how that's possible. According to historical accounts, Caligula had a deep attachment to this horse and often lavished it with attention and gifts and lots of pets, I bet. He even went so far as to build a marble stand for Unsettling, his horse, and reportedly discussed making him a consul. First of all, a marble stand? Who's gonna... That's insane. Secondly, the decision to make the horse a priest was likely a political move just to mock the Roman Senate, which Caligula was known to despise at the time. So, I don't know, the act was seen as a demonstration of Caligula's power and disregard for traditional Roman customs and or values. Yeah, I would say so. Guy brings a horse in. Imagine being a taxpayer and you see this. Oh, I'd be livid. Number 8. Abraham Lincoln the wrestler. Abraham Lincoln was a vampire hunter in that one movie, but in real life, he was also a wrestler. Yeah, he was kind of a badass. Who knew? Abe Lincoln was a famous American statesman and politician who of course served as the 16th president of the United States from 1861 until he was killed in 1865. Now, as a young man, before he changed history, of course. As a young man, Lincoln was known for his impressive physical strength and was said to have been an accomplished wrestler. Yeah, if he had seen that attack coming, he probably would have knocked them right out. I don't know. Dude's choking out politicians. Like what? According to some accounts, he participated in several wrestling matches in his youth, including one in which he was defeated by a man named Jack Armstrong. Yeah, imagine tapping out Abe Lincoln. How dare you, Jack? What are you doing? Lincoln was also a big fan of wrestling and often attended matches just to watch, even though he wasn't, getting in tights and brawling with people. In fact, it's said that once he walked 20 miles just to watch a wrestling match where his favorite wrestler, Cornelius the Cornishman Grogan, was competing. So yeah, he was committed to the bits, He was committed to the craft, I guess. His involvement in the sport helped to cement its popularity in the United States. Of course, being a president who wrestled, that's, yeah, fair, that ought to do it. Don't mess with Abe, I guess, or else he'll choke you out or something. Number 7, yellow attire. Back in 1420, the Venetian government issued a law requiring ladies of the night to wear yellow attire as a way to easily identify and also regulate their profession. Yeah, anyone looks like a big bright banana. There you go. You're banana. The law was intended to control the spread of sexually transmitted disease and prevent the moral decay of Venice. So that was their solution. Hey, we're gonna wear yellow tops now. That'll solve everything. Nice. These ladies were required to wear a yellow veil and a yellow tunic, but they were also prohibited from wearing any expensive clothing or jewelry. Yeah, no personality, no fun at all, just business. The color yellow was chosen because, well, it was associated with betrayal, envy, and illness. All things sex, I guess. The law remained in effect until the end of the 16th century. My dad has a really bright yellow shirt. I have a new nickname for him now. Can't wait to call him after I'm done filming this one. Called Banana Bill. It's a good one. Number 6, no tennis. Yeah, you wanna play doubles? Think again, pal. How dare you? The 1495 tennis law, it was real. It was a French law that prohibited the playing of tennis in public spaces. So if you're gonna do it quietly and privately in your own home, all right? How dare you? Don't even think about playing tennis. Even after this video, don't do it. The law was enacted by King Charles VIII to address concerns about the game being too violent. Yeah, it was supposedly being used to train for combat and the potential for public disorder. Tennis. Yeah, who knew? The law also imposed penalties for those caught violating it, including confiscation of property and imprisonment. Yeah, what are you in for? I was playing doubles with my mother-in-law, so now I'm in prison, I guess. Huh. Yeah, you killed 9 people. Nice. Can't wait to bunk with you. Despite its intended purpose, the law did not prevent the game from being played, obviously. Can't stop us, pal. It slowly evolved into our modern day tennis, which we love. I love it, it's awesome. Tennis is very intense also. I don't disagree with any of these laws put in place. My father and I got in a bout one time over the lines. Gotta watch those lines. You need a line guy if you're playing tennis. You need it. Number 5, not reporting a dead body. Yeah, this was a big deal. I mean, it still is, but hear me out. This one reminds me of Stand By Me. What a classic. You can find dead whales, dead bodies. It's the dark ages. You gotta find a lot of things, but you gotta report them, all right? It's the law. You gotta report dead whales and you gotta report dead people. Both very important. In medieval times, roughly around 1240, the law surrounding the discovery of a dead body, well, it varied depending on the region and the time period, of course. But generally, if somebody discovered a dead body, they were required to report it to the courts, or the lords rather, my lady. So quiet. That's all medieval times right there. Failure to do so could result in punishment, as it was considered suspicious behavior, which, you know, fair. We'll ask some questions regardless, no matter what. More often than not, the finder would be asked to provide information about the circumstances surrounding this death, including any possible suspects. Yeah, take a guess, detective, no pressure. In some cases, the finder may have been entitled to a reward for discovering the body, and in other cases, well, you yourself could be charged with the death of said body. So, I don't know, 50-50. Let's do one of these. Oh, I didn't see anything. See ya. Number 4, no stealing dead whales. I mentioned it. You want to know more? Sure, let's do it. I'm not sure how one would do this, first of all, without the help of 490 of their closest friends, because whales are pretty heavy. But the no stealing dead whales law originated in the 17th century in England, where beached whales at the time, they were considered a valuable commodity due to their oil, their meat, their bones, whatever. The law made it illegal at this point to take a beached or stranded whale without permission from authorities or lords, and violation of the law could result in fines or imprisonment. Again, imagine going to jail for a whale. Your bunkie has 19 kills. You're like, yeah, I took a whale, so have at her. I can't get a kayak into water without pulling something. You're telling me medieval mobs, hungry mobs, drag whales back home? That's impressive, really, if anything. Guys must have been jacked. Nice leg workout. All beached whales in the UK have belonged to the king or the queen since 1324. One guy back in the early 2000s, he actually offered a dead whale to Her Majesty, but she politely declined. But he was doing it right, you know what I mean? He read some medieval books. He was like, good evening. All right, bring it in. Number 3, Able and Baker. Okay, we often remember Laika, the space dog, and her 103-minute cosmic journey around Sputnik 2. Very short and sweet trip there. But does anybody remember Able and Baker? These two? Are you kidding me? This was America's version of Laika. This was less than 2 years later. On May 28th, 1959, the United States launched 2 female primates, Able and Baker, into space. Yeah, we launched monkeys into space. Then we made them snowboard and make movies about skateboarding. But first, we launched them into space, which was crazy. This mission lasted 15 minutes and they both safely returned back home with trauma. Lots of monkey trauma. The monkeys weren't injured from the cosmic commute, but a radio message came in shortly after they splashed down in the Atlantic, and the message said no injuries or other difficulties. It said Able, Baker, perfect. Yeah, perfect. I mean, probably not, but they were alive, so perfect enough. I don't think we can blast any more primates into space going 10,000 miles an hour. That's just my guess, but this was 1959. Things have changed a bit. Abel sadly passed away shortly after the flight. Meanwhile, Baker got all that fame. She got really famous. She was getting 150 letters a day, like fan mail letters. How is space? What's it like? Were you in movies? Can you skateboard as well, like that guy on TV? Imagine if she had Twitter back then. Oh man, these ladies are icons. Never mind Laika. Hit that thumbs up for Abel and subscribe for Baker. Here we go. They're watching right now. They're watching you do it, so you better do it. Number 2, the boot. We'll finish with some medieval punishments because, I'm watching Game of Thrones again right now, so why not? Let's do this. The boot was interesting. This was a scary punishment that you won't believe actually happened. We didn't learn about this one back in school. The device at hand here was a massive oversized boot, large enough to fit both of your feet, and it was also made of iron or copper. You see where I'm going here. While these boots were often brazed onto the floor, so the accused couldn't move around anywhere, and most of the time they were sitting upright. Now the boots at this point were filled with boiling water, or worse, molten lead. And from that point on, well, it's not gonna be great for you, is it? Another medieval punishment involving boots, which is somehow worse in my opinion, was first seen in Ireland. They were lightweight metal boots that were filled with water, individual, then they heated your feet over a fire until the water inside started to boil out the top of the boot. So, I don't know which one's worse, honestly. I'd rather the first one because then it would be faster, know what I mean? I'm not watching something boil. A watched boot never boils, I guess. Number 1, rats. Yeah, save the rats for last. Sure. This one really sums up how terrible humans have been in the past. Rat punishment originated in ancient Rome, classic, but it's been seen many times since, including in Game of Thrones, yeah. What was once called a rat trap involved the accused being tied down to something, and then a metal enclosure would be strapped down onto their abdomen or their chest. Now, inside this metal enclosure, there are of course rats. One or numerous, I don't know, both suck, which the strapped down person can feel walking around with their little rat feet. And at this point, the person instilling the punishment begins heating the other end of the metal enclosure. Now, historically, hot coals were placed on top, which of course very quickly creates a hot environment for these little scurrying plague rats inside on your chest. I'm getting so hot saying this. From here, the rats begin frantically searching for a way out because, just like us, they have survival instincts. But unlike us, they have really sharp teeth. The sharpest teeth ever. The metal enclosure is too hard to bite into, but a human's chest, that is not. That is fine. You see where this is going now. The rats would eat their way out of the danger and into you, which would cause you a lot of pain. I'm gonna go throw up now.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have the Kensington system. Queen Victoria's reign began in 1837 and it lasted up until her death in 1901. She was just 18 years old when she found herself on the throne, and it was all by chance, as she was actually 5th in line when she was born. This is all stressful enough, but certainly one of the worst parts of her upbringing was being brought up under the Kensington system. This basically all started when her mother, Duchess Victoria of Kent, created this system in order to control her daughter. Literally just isolated her away from all of her friends and even from other family members, and apparently this was done to keep her quote-unquote pure. The Duchess would monitor her every move, she would decide who she could see and who she could speak to, and Victoria only had 2 friends she could play with growing up, one being her half-sister and the other being her mother's attendant, Sir John Conroy. Victoria was even forced to share a room with her mother until she was queen. She couldn't even walk down the hall by herself. In the end, Victoria placed a lot of blame on John Conroy for manipulating her mother. She even called him the demon incarnate. In our number 9 spot today, we have the royal affairs. There have been many rumors over the years about the royal family and their extramarital affairs. Okay, I'm not saying it's a tradition, but it happens a lot, and I'm saying this goes way back. So far back that one of the first accusations of this within the royal family dates all the way back to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Since then, it has only continued with people such as Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend, Princess Anne and Commander Timothy Lawrence, and of course King Charles and Queen Consort Camilla, just to name a few. The latter of those definitely being the most famous, especially when the now king was confronted about it by his wife at the time, the beloved Princess Diana. Apparently, King Charles responded to the confrontation by saying, quote, "Well, I refuse to be the only Prince of Wales who never had a mistress." Maybe not the attitude to keep when you're speaking to your wife, who you're cheating on. I don't know. Guess I'm just not royal enough to get it. In our number 8 spot today, we have pets. As we all know very well, image is everything for the royal family, and that is down to the finest, smallest detail, including pets. It is well known that the Queen absolutely loved corgis, and how could we possibly blame her? Apparently, however, if a dog is not a corgi or a Labrador, it is socially looked down upon. Can't describe how insane that is. They're dogs. If you brought a dog who had just been rolling around in the mud everywhere with you, I could see why that wouldn't be as widely accepted among fancy social circles, but only giving the choice of a few random breeds seems kind of ridiculous. Apparently, Meghan Markle actually had to give up her beagle named Guy a few years ago before she joined the family, and then left it. I guess she can probably have whatever dog she wants now, so there's always an upside. In our number 7 spot today, we have King Charles I. Okay, this is one that goes way back and it really creeps me out. So King Charles I, right now we're on the 3rd, so we're taking it a couple back. King Charles I was tried for treason after the Civil War, and he ended up being beheaded in 1649. I guess in the 1600s everyone was beheaded, so this wasn't necessarily abnormal, which is certainly weird, but that's a history lesson for another day. The weird part of this, however, is that apparently his head was sewn back on his body so that he could sit for a portrait, or it was perhaps supposed to be a sign of respect. Either way, it's very weird and very gross. I feel terrible for whoever's job it was to do that, and I also feel bad for the artist who was forced to paint that. Talk about traumatic. It does certainly make sense though that people say that Charles' ghost still haunts a building, because there is no amount of haunting that could make up for being beheaded and then having your head sewn back onto your body. Okay, why'd we do the first part if we were gonna do the second? Could've just cut the middleman, you know? But instead, they cut his head off, okay? In our number 6 spot today, we have never travel in pairs. This is one travel rule that certainly makes sense, but it is really dark when you think about it. This rule is one that the British royal family, and honestly many people who can afford this sort of luxury safety, do nowadays. This tradition and rule is one that means that any heirs to the throne are not allowed to travel together. This is of course in case some sort of accident happens. Not every heir to the throne would be injured or perhaps killed. It's definitely very smart and sensible, but it has got to be grim, just constantly preparing for the worst thing to happen. It is of the utmost importance to the royal family that they preserve the line to the throne. Like I mentioned before, however, other people are now taking a page out of the royal book and are using this travel rule where possible. In our number 5 spot today, we have the black outfit. Another travel rule that the royal family must follow is in regards to an item that they have to bring with them on all trips, whether business or pleasure. It is pretty unusual to see the royal family dressed in black, despite when a specific occasion calls for it, but every time they travel, they're required to bring an all-black outfit with them. This is to prepare for the worst case scenario. If they are away on a trip and somebody important to them passes away, they need to ensure that they are ready with the appropriate clothing for when they're able to touch down on their home soil. This is of course very practical, but it's definitely kind of morbid. I mean, you're having to fuss over what you're gonna wear when you're actually just mourning the loss of someone close to you. It certainly wouldn't be the top of my list of things to focus on, but maybe that's why I'm not cut out for royalty. Okay. In our number 4 spot today, we have the rules of the road. Okay, this like rule or tradition or law, I guess, is probably one of the craziest things I've ever heard, but I guess it's been around for quite a while and I just had no idea. As it turns out, the monarch is the only person in the UK who is allowed to drive without a legal license or even license plates. Like, that's insane. I didn't expect the king to have to take a driver's test like everyone else, but just having a rule that allows them, if they chose to drive without any idea how? It's pretty bizarre. The good news is though, which makes this rule make a lot more sense, is that of course, rather than driving himself, King Charles' chauffeur will be much more responsible for most of the driving for the king. Let's just hope the chauffeur has their driver's license. I'm not gonna lie, there's this like silly photo of the queen, and every time I think about like the monarch driving without a license, I just think of this like little photo. She's got like a little silly grin on her face. She looks mischievous. And that's what I like to think, her just driving with no license. In our number 3 spot today, we have the armed forces. This is a tradition or system that comes into play when a new monarch comes into power. So last year this happened with the king after the passing of the queen. It is definitely one of the most intimidating parts of his new role, and this is that King Charles now becomes the head of the armed forces. This means that it is his responsibility, and he is the only person who can declare when the country is at war and when the war is over. Of course, he won't be doing this entirely alone. He needs to follow the advice and guidance of the government. The perhaps good news is that the new king has held quite close ties to the armed forces throughout his life, even spending time in the Royal Navy and taking flying instruction from the Royal Air Force during his second year at Cambridge University. Of course, the hope is that he won't have to be in a position to make these difficult decisions, but when or if he's faced with them, we can hope he makes the proper decisions for the country. In our number 2 spot today, we have no touching. There is a rule that you just cannot touch a royal. I'm sure there's a multitude of reasons for this, mostly to do with security, but aside from a very lucky handshake, you really are supposed to keep your distance. I suppose it's because I live the life of a regular person, but I kind of feel like in some ways this might be a little sad. I feel like you might be lacking in so much connection with a ton of interesting people, and like some of the people that you meet, wouldn't you just be dying to hug them? You know, apparently this is part of the reason why the queen always wore gloves. She of course shook a lot of hands while making her royal appearances, and the same will likely go for the new king. Maybe he'll take up gloves as a fashion accessory, just like his mother. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have the church. So we talked about the armed forces, and King Charles won't only be the head of the armed forces, but he will also become the head of the church in England. Quite a jump from talking about war and being the one who makes those kinds of decisions to being the head of the church, where things hopefully are quite the opposite. This is a post that British monarchs have held since the church was founded by King Henry VIII in the 1500s, and it appears as though the tradition will carry on. In this role, it means that King Charles will be responsible for appointing archbishops and bishops to their role. The king will of course be advised in this role by the Prime Minister, and it is said that the king is religious in his own right and that he has already spoken about how his personal faith has informed his approach to leadership.
Number 10, the Judas cradle. Right off the hop, we'll start with a bad one. I mean, they're all pretty bad, but this one is so specific, you know what I mean? This is a brutal torture device used in the medieval ages to punish those who were accused of adultery or blasphemy. Yeah, adultery. This is what would happen to you. Imagine this. The victim would be placed on top of a pyramid shaped seat, not really a seat at all, just a sharp pyramid, and they'd be slowly lowered onto it by ropes. Now, the pointed tip of said seat/pyramid would penetrate their anything in this region at all bad, all rough time. And this of course would often lead to death due to infection. The Judas cradle was painful, it was intimate, and it was slow. It was horrible. It was considered an effective way of obtaining confessions from suspects. Even if they were innocent, they're like, sure, I did it. Get me off of this thing. What the fuck? This painful and gruesome method of punishment is thankfully no longer in use today, obviously, but occasionally I'm gonna pop up and remind you not to forget about it. It's horrible. The Justice Department has things to fix today, sure, I'll say that, but at least we're not lowering the accused onto the chair of death. Let's leave that one in the past. Number 9, the choke pear. Great name, already looking forward to this one. Also known as the pear of anguish. The pear of anguish was a medieval punishment device used to humiliate its victims, really. The device was inserted into the victim's mouth, or again, other places, and then slowly expanded open using a screw mechanism until it reached its full size. Yeah, almost like something from Saw, just like that, exactly. This caused immense pain and often resulted in permanent injury or, of course, as you can imagine, death. The choke pear was also used to extract confessions from suspects or prisoners. Despite its gruesome nature, the choke pear actually remained in use for centuries and was only officially banned in the 19th century. Yeah, you're like, what is this, ancient Egypt, Rome, Greek, what is this? No, it's like 200 years ago. Today, examples of the device can be found in museums, so if you see something that looks kind of like a choke pear, they're all fancy for some reason. Take a minute and reflect on these horrors. They used to punish men for homosexuality with a choke pear. Humans are disgusting. Number 8, scaphism. First used in ancient Persia. The victim here would be stripped naked and placed inside of 2 hollowed out tree trunks, or sometimes boats. But only their heads, hands, and feet were exposed. You were literally stuck in a tree. Now, if that's not already uncomfortable and haunting in the hot sun already, they would then be force-fed honey and milk until they were extremely ill. And of course, all of that happening in tight quarters inside of a tree trunk. Well, as time passed, maggots would eat away at the victim's flesh, causing infections and gangrene. And also, it's horrible. It's so uncomfortable. The process could take days or even weeks to kill the victim. This method of punishment was meant to be slow and painful. And of course, the typical ancient fashion, it was very public. Everyone came out to watch, serving as a warning to others who may have committed similar crimes that somehow deserve being stuck in a tree. No way. Number 7, the punishment of non-existence. Ooh, this one's pretty good. It's different, but it's definitely worth a mention on our list today. When we talk about pharaohs or pretty much anything from ancient history, we know nothing. I mean, really, so many books destroyed, that much time passed. There's countless leaders that we know nothing of, and it has a little something to do with damnatio memoriae. Damnatio memoriae was a practice in ancient Rome that involved erasing the memory of an individual or group from history. Just ever gone. Control Alt Delete. See you later, Brad. This was done by destroying any and all physical evidence of their existence, such as statues or inscriptions, and banning the use of their name. That's incredible. It was typically used to punish individuals who had committed treason or other crimes against the state, but it could also be applied to those who were, well, simply unpopular with the ruling class. Yeah, getting canceled, but in ancient Rome. There we go. Some guy's scratching your face out of a rock. He's like, nah, you don't exist anymore, buddy. How's that sound? That's horrible. That is so, I mean, cutting to 2023 now, yeah, they're gone. We have no idea who they are. The effectiveness of this varied depending on the circumstances. I mean, in some cases, it succeeded in erasing the memory or the group completely, while in others, it only generated more interest in them. You know what I mean? You cancel somebody now today and you're like, well, who are these people? What did they do? Today we do this, but it's just, blocking somebody on socials. Mute. See ya. Number 6, Iron Maiden. Great, now Run to the Hills. It's gonna be stuck in my head all day. Not bad, honestly not bad. Hit the thumbs up for the Iron Maiden band. Not for this content, just for the band. Iron Maidens were tricky. An Iron Maiden was a device used in the Middle Ages, and it was an upright coffin-shaped humanoid-looking box with spikes on the inside that would puncture the victim when they were placed inside and had that big scary door closed. The spikes were long enough to cause significant pain and injury, but not long enough to kill the victim immediately. Ergo, horribleness. The victim would be left inside for hours or even days, slowly succumbing to their injuries and eventually dying from infection or, well, just blood loss. This method of punishment was considered cruel due to its prolonged nature and the physical torment that it inflicted on the victim. Because yeah, even without the spikes inside, this one would drive me nuts. Oh, terrifying. It's like the movie Buried, but somehow worse. Number 5, trial by ordeal. Trial by ordeal of water was insane. It's honestly hilarious to think of. It was a medieval method of determining guilt or innocence. Now the accused would be thrown into a body of water, often a river or a pond, something dirty back then, and if they floated, well, it was believed that God was protecting them and that they were innocent. But if they sank, however, well, they were deemed guilty. They were naughty, right? This practice was based on the belief that water, being a pure element created by the Lord, would reject impurities such as sin. And it was also thought that drowning was an acceptable punishment for those who were deemed guilty. Because, yeah, sure, the trial by ordeal of water was widely used throughout Europe during the Middle Ages and continued until the early modern period. So yeah, it lasted a while. However, it was eventually abolished due to its high mortality rate and, well, lack of reliability in determining guilt or innocence. It was a bunch of bullshit. Who knew? Water rejects impurities. That would be jarring. You try and have a bath, you just get launched out, and you're like, oh, okay then. Gotcha. Heard. Number 4, the lead sprinkler. The lead sprinkler device dates back to medieval times, as all these great gadgets do, and it was used as a form of punishment for those who committed crimes such as heresy or treason. The device consisted of a hollow metal sphere with a long handle. It looks like something you'd get from Elden Ring. It's like a weird looking wand, I don't know. It was then filled with molten lead or boiling oil. You already know where I'm going with this one. The Punisher would then hold the sphere over the victim's naked body, always naked again, and then allow the hot liquid to drip through small holes onto your skin, causing severe burns and excruciating pain. Now, over time, variations of the lead sprinkler were developed, including ones with multiple spouts to, increase the amount of liquid being poured onto victim or victims. Yeah, they got creative. Just the thing you want to hear in this kind of list. They toyed around with some ideas, sure. Number 3, the guillotine. A classic, not quite ancient, but we gotta mention it. First seen in France during the late 18th century as an alternative to other forms of capital punishment, all those other horrible versions. Those were seen as cruel and inhumane, but this one, dare I say, changed the game. It quickly became the preferred method of execution in France and was used extensively throughout the French Revolution to execute thousands of people, including King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette. The guillotine's popularity spread throughout Europe, with several countries adopting it as their primary means of capital punishment. They're like, hey, that looks pretty cheap and horrible, let's do that. It continued to be used until the mid-20th century when most countries abolished capital punishment punishment altogether. Now, despite its gruesome reputation, some argue that the guillotine was a humane method of execution because it was quick and painless compared to the other 9 that I've mentioned on this list. Oh my god. Number 2. The thumbscrew. This one, for some reason, this one hits me the most. Thumbscrews were a method of inflicting pain by crushing the fingers or the toes, or sometimes the knees. They would make massive thumbscrews. Knee screws, almost. The victim's digits were inserted into the screw and then it was slowly tightened, causing, of course, excruciating pain and potentially permanent damage. This form of punishment was commonly used during medieval times, of course, and as means of extracting information. Yeah, if you do that to me, I'll say anything in 4 minutes or less. It was also seen during the Spanish Inquisition to force confessions from those suspected of heresy. Thumbscrews were often made of iron or brass and could be adjusted to increase or decrease pressure on your body. Anywhere. Like I said earlier, they would get creative with where they would put these screws of death. Not good. Despite its brutal nature, thumbscrew torture remained in use for centuries before eventually falling out of favor due to its, well, extreme cruelty. At what point do you decide, right? Like some guy's like, you know what? It's a little bit too much. Let's get this one. We're just gonna put him in the coffin for now. Thumbscrews are so old. And finally, number 1, cement shoes. We'll end on a 20th century mafia punishment because why not, all right? I wrote the thing. I can talk about what I want. Let's do it. You made it this far too. We'll end on a not horrible one. Cement shoes involved placing the victim's feet in, well, as you could guess, buckets filled with wet concrete, which then of course hardens around their feet. Science right there. That's how that works. Unless you have a moving truck thing, then that cement's gonna dry pretty fast. At that point, you're unable to move or escape and the victim is then thrown into a body of water to sink down and drown. This brutal technique was popularized by organized crime groups and mafias and stuff like that back in the early 20th century as a way to dispose of informants or those who had betrayed the group. Betrayed the mafia. The first recorded use of cement shoes was in New York City in 1935 when 2 victims were found dead with their feet encased in concrete. Yeah, new fear unlocked. I never knew. There we go. Now kicking off our list at number 10, the boot. Anything that starts with a the, it's bad news right there. Oversized boots made of iron or copper, these are a little different than Uggs. Pay attention. These boots were often brazed onto the floor, so the accused, well, ideally they couldn't move around anywhere at all. Most of the time they were just sitting upright. They were stuck. It was welded to the ground. The boots at this time were filled with boiling water or molten lead, both pretty bad. And from that point on, well, it's not gonna be great. You're probably not gonna survive. Another medieval punishment involving boots, which is somehow worse in my opinion, was first seen in Ireland. They were lightweight metal boots that were filled with water and then heated over a fire until the water was boiling as well as your feet. I don't know, comment down below, which is worse? To me, the second one is way worse. I don't like a slow boil. I don't like that. A watched pot never boils. Maybe that trick will work. Who knows? Number 9, the instep borer. We'll start at the feet and we'll make our way up to the body. Why not? The instep borer was a medieval German punishment instrument. Again, quite creative, these medieval folks. This iron boot was much more mobile than the last pair of boots, that one for sure. See, this was just one shoe, rather. A shoe that hinged open to allow your foot to slide in. And then from then on out, just trouble. Slow chaos. A crank would protrude out of the top of the foot, and if you were to turn said crank slowly, well, on the inside of this iron shoe was a thick serrated iron blade, cutting deeper and deeper with each rotation of the crank. This location of this crank was purposeful because most of the time, the accused would bleed out fast. No recovering from that one. Still better than Uggs, in my opinion, but whatever. Number 8. Branks. The branks. Here we go. Sounds horrible. Branks were used to punish nagging wives, or slandering wives, or cursing wives, or women who performed or practiced witchcraft. If you criticize Christianity, love it. But if you had an opinion or you can do math, you get the branks pretty much. It was horrible. A scold's bridle, or branks, much more fun to say, was a device usually reserved for women. Yeah, classic medieval times history. It wasn't just a muzzle either. We always look at it as if it was a muzzle. No, it was a lot worse than that. It was a cage for the head with an iron plate projecting into the mouth, even pressing down on top of the tongue. More often than not, this plate was studded with spikes so that if the tongue moved at all, ergo if you were to speak, it would cause you to bleed out. Now again, you can't open your mouth with this device, so that is double trouble. It was first seen in Scotland back in 1567 and later used in England. Branks were commonly used again on women of the lower classes whose speech was troublesome. Yeah, what does it even mean, right? Some shaped like an animal's head, so you'd have have a cow for somebody that was considered lazy, a donkey for someone considered a fool, a hare for an eavesdropper, or a pig for a glutton. Yeah, God forbid you had an opinion in the Dark Ages. Number 7, the iron chair. Not to be confused with the iron throne, although I'm sure that one wasn't too comfortable to sit on. Just a chair of swords. The iron chair has spikes covering the back, all along the armrests, the seat. There's spikes everywhere. It's dangerous. 500 to 1500 rusty spikes on average per chair. That's a lot of work. It's a lot of welding work. Oh my gosh. The victim's wrists were tied to the chair, of course, because you'll want to get off of it immediately. Now that's bad enough, being stuck sitting on this chair, but some variants got creative and made it even somehow worse. Some variants of the iron chair had holes underneath the chair's bottom, and that's where red hot coals would be placed to cause you severe burns. It's like from Casino Royale, only a lot worse. Sometimes weights would even be added, making matters much worse. Now this chair was meant to get a confession out of the accused because although it sounds quite fatal, no spikes could actually penetrate a vital organ and wounds were closed immediately by the spikes themselves. Sounds awful, but it wasn't the worst. I mean it is, but you know what I mean. You didn't die all the time. Number 6, coffins. I'm not talking about, these types of coffins with vampires, like, coffins you bury in the ground. That would be a bad way to go out, no doubt about it. But this coffin that I'm talking about, much worse. Here, the victim was placed up high, not down below. They were placed up high in a cage that was so small you could barely fit inside of it. Stuck in one spot, usually with limbs sticking out. The live victim was most of the time left to starve or die of thirst. Or exposure. Yeah, those limbs sticking out, insects, the sun all day. It doesn't matter what you get at this point, but it's slow and it's gonna suck. And of course, in medieval fashion, it's gonna be quite public. Everyone's not working, no one has jobs in medieval times. We're all just watching some guy stuck in a cage. We're like, sure, this is it, we're living. UFC. Number 5, denailing. Okay, the forcible extraction of one's fingernails or toenails. Or both. Lovely. Hey, before we move on, let's give that thumbs up a click. Yeah, the little thumbnail right there that we see on the screen. Let's spread a little positivity into this list. I need it. I don't know, I feel like you need it as well. Thank you so much. Back to denailing. This was a favorite method of medieval punishment because, well, sounds horrible, but it was easy. You just needed a really strong guy and some medieval pliers and, well, Bob's your uncle. You're getting a confession. A variant used in medieval Spain introduced a sharp wedge of wood underneath the flesh and in between the actual nail itself, which is horrible. The wedge was then slowly hammered into this grove more and more until the nail popped off. Yeah, thumbs up for thumbnails popping off in history. We try here on B. Number 4, damnatio ad bestias, also known as killing by wild animals. I'm a dog lover too, I can't read this one. Damnatio ad bestias was a form of Roman capital punishment in which the accused was killed by wild animals in the arena. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, oh, kind of similar to Gladiator and what they had to do. No, this was much sooner. This was a little different. This was 80 years sooner. Now, at this point, in Gladiator, they could defend themselves to some degree. Those meeting their fate with this method, they were always defenseless, and sometimes tied to one spot, or they were given a small weapon made of wood. It was an insult, really, no chance of surviving. This form of punishment was seen in ancient Rome starting around the 2nd century BC, but 80 or so years later, the Colosseum then saw a similar practice, only then it was public viewing, it was a big spectacle, it was an event, and most importantly, gladiators could fight back with tridents or nets. Both are horrible. I'd rather just get it done with, to be honest. I'm not fighting a lion. No way. Look at me. I'm like 110 pounds soaking wet. I'm not gonna fight. I'll fight a zebra, maybe. I'll fight like an emu. I could probably take an emu. Number 3, hanging. Again, a little straightforward, but I'll try and provide some history for this one. Sure, some hanging history. Okay. Ugh. Hanging is quick. I mean, that's when it's supposed to be. Hanging can be one of 2 ways: suspension by the limbs as a form of punishment, or hanging by the neck as a form of capital punishment. We don't often think about the first version. Being strung up by an arm, that's gotta suck, that's pretty uncomfortable. I can't even raise my arm in class for longer than 5 minutes. I gotta switch it up, know what I mean? These shoulders are weak. Strappado, oh, this would have been a nightmare. Strappado was the form in which your wrists were tied behind your head, eventually causing your shoulders to dislocate. I don't know what's worse out of all 3 of those. They all suck. I would do the get it done with, honestly. I don't want to live for any of this. Number 2, rats. If you're a rat lover, this one's gonna suck. I know some people have rats. They like to do tricks and crawl around their neck and in their mouths. That's cool. I'm not a rat guy myself, but don't knock it till I try it. Rat punishment originated in ancient Rome, and ever since then, it unfortunately has been part of the most horrible, gruesome punishments every era past. What was once called a rat trap involved a man being tied down to something and then a metal bin or an enclosure, a bucket of some sort, strapped to his abdomen or his chest. Now inside this enclosure, there are rats, which the strapped down person can definitely feel walking and sniffing around on your bare skin. Now this is when the person instilling the punishment begins heating the other end of the metal enclosure. Historically, hot coals were usually placed on top, which of course very quickly creates a bad hot environment for these rats inside. Now from here, these rats begin to panic, right? They frantically search for a way out, any way out, because like us, they have survival instincts. Metal enclosure is too hard to bite into, but a human's flesh is not. You can probably eat your way through that. You can see where this is going, and you probably just went at your computer. Yeah, there we go. Now you get it. Let's move on. Poor rats as well, right? Like, come on, those little animals, they don't want to do that. They don't want to eat a six-pack today. I don't want that. Finally, number 1, the rack. The rack was a device that was made out of a wooden rectangle as a frame. You've probably seen this in Game of Thrones, and that's about it. The person being punished here would have their limbs attached to the 4 sides with chains, and then the people doing the punishing, with the helps of rollers and pulleys and a couple of very strong guys, they would stretch out the person until either the limbs were torn clean off from the body or they got pulled out from their sockets and then couldn't be used anymore. As I'm saying this, I want to faint. This is so horrible. I said I felt lightheaded typing this up. This is really bad. Imagine being around in a time where people actually used to do this and you didn't just watch it on Game of Thrones for 12 bucks a month. And again, more often than not, it was public. So embarrassing. Watching your shoulder get popped out, you're like, oh, just stop. Number 10, knocker upper. All right, sounds a little different than its actual purpose. Hear me out. Alarm clocks, they're not great, right? They suck, no doubt about it. Now take the alarm clock and assign that job to a real life person. What does that look like? What does that sound like, rather? At 6 a.m. That person is called a knocker upper. A person employed solely to wake up workers at mills and factories on those early morning shifts. Now, going from house to house using a long pole to knock on bedroom windows, that sounds like the best job ever, right? I can't close the list with this one. This is number 10, for sure. It's kind of fun. If you had this job, well, you're probably not alive anymore. I don't know, unless you live in a weird town. The people at the time were a lot friendlier back then than they are now, so, you know, I'm sure the knocker-upper came around today, be a little different. They'd probably be on World Star the next day. Knocker-uppers back in the day, thank you so much for waking me up. I would have lost $14, thank you. It was a big deal, it was definitely a big deal. Number 9. The Linkerman. Before the introduction of gas lights on the streets of London, if you were traveling alone at night, well, you probably get lost. Because, yeah, even London now I'd get lost, you know what I mean? So that's where a linkerman would ideally come into play. They'd come in to save your night. What they would do is they would carry with them a torch to help guide your way home. They'd be like, hey, follow me, I know these streets, and then you do it, I guess. It's a little scary. At the end of this impromptu tour, they'd of course expect a little tip from you. Of course, thank you for lighting my path and getting me home. Cheers. Here's 1 nickel. It's actually a lot back then. Here's 1 penny. There we go. They weren't so bad. They were generally pretty helpful in getting you from point A to B, whilst also being able to see 1 foot in front of the other. That doesn't hurt, especially in Victorian London. You get to step on a dirty rat. That'll be gross. It's like a friend walking you home, only you don't know them. And it's the Victorian era, so probably pretty unsafe. 50-50 if you're gonna make it. And their charge was usually 1 farthing or the equivalent of a quarter. The linkerman, like a lot of the jobs on this list, was actually featured in a lot of art and literature from that era. And there were even a couple famous linkermans, like Lawrence Casey, for example, who was the personal linker boy for the courtesan Betty Careless. Imagine that, your arm must be so strong with that lamp all day. Ooh, it's just like, oh, I can't put it down. Number 8, ghost photography. 1800s ghost photography. Apparently it was a theme or a vibe, I don't know, but there were people that would take the photos of these ghosts. So at one point you would be hired as a professional ghost photographer. On paper, here's your tax returns, that's what I did. The camera, of course, was a hot new invention back then, so tales of ghost and spirit were easily believed, especially when you have a photo of a see-through woman. That probably helps sell your tale for sure. Like, here she is. It's like, that's mom. That's definitely not, you just did that in the back room. I don't believe you. A big name in the ghost game was that of William Thomas Stead. He was born in 1849, so now he's for sure a ghost. Stead was the son of a Congregationalist minister, and at the age of 22, he was appointed as editor of the Northern Echo, which was a regional newspaper in Darlington. Yeah, this British medium, Richard Borsonal, featured a photo of W.T. Stead and a spirit. Imagine that. Imagine a day where somebody was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize and they also posed for photo ops with ghosts. Like, can we pick a lane? Science or not? What are we doing here? Number 7, grave designs. Graves, but make them cool, you know? Customize your own pit in the ground. That's fun, that's grim. In the late 1700s, cholera, bacterial infections, pretty much anything floating around your mouth and eyes, it was spreading and it was bad. Not a good thing to ingest. Not an ideal time in history. Many were biting the bullet at this time, of course being gravely ill. But with this came a dark, new, fun trend. Yeah, here we go. The safety coffin. Yeah, let's make your own coffin, DIY. These coffins, God forbid, you were buried alive, while these safety coffins would allow the dead to rise again. Yeah, some Tony Stark guy in the back's like, if you push this, the body will pop back out and come to life. It's like, really? A lot of these coffins were built with extra comfort on the inside and of course a wire, the safety backup wire. This wire ran through the coffin, through the ground, and attached to a bell on the outside on the ground. So if somebody was walking by and they heard a bell ringing beside a gravestone, first of all, it's haunting, well, they know something's up and they can get them out. But folks would get creative with their safety coffins. They would ask the inventor to make them crazy things, like a man named Robert Robinson from Manchester. He had some odd requests. He passed away in 1791, but he instructed his family and watchmen to open the special door on his coffin after he passed. This special door would reveal a layer of glass. Yeah, so if anybody saw any condensation, well, you know he's still alive and get him out. Only he wasn't alive. And now we just have the world's scariest exhibit, just a real life dead man. Let's close that back up forever. I don't want a glass coffin, that's disgusting. Number 6, rat catcher. I mean, obviously you know what's gonna happen with the name the rat catcher. It's gonna make a lot of you out there squirm in your seats, and I apologize in advance. Hit that thumbs up, you know, let's even out the energy. Rats in Victorian England, they were a massive problem. They were everywhere. Every nook and cranny of your home probably had a dirty, fat rat just sitting there with its weird teeth looking at you. From the basement to the pipes, everywhere. It was literally a big problem. There's even an account of them spilling over from royal parks. So imagine that. So of course there's a problem. So of course where there's a problem, there's now a job, right? Someone's got to do something about it. Rat catchers were pretty famous throughout the Victorian era. I mean, of course, brave souls, and they were highly praised in society, but the job, obviously, wasn't too glamorous. You'd be going into dark, dirty places where rats would make their homes, and we'd catch them, and you'd often have to kill thousands of rats every single year, and then deal with that. I don't even know how you deal with those bodies. I was gonna say bones, ew. More often than not, rat catchers would use other animals like dogs and ferrets to help them hunt down the rats, so you have your own little animal posse hunting down other animals. You would feel pretty good. You'd feel like the king of animals almost. Probably not, eh? It's probably a disgusting job. You probably hate it every day. Number 5, matchstick makers. The idea of a lighter wasn't really a big thing back in the Victorian era, obviously. I mean, they definitely existed. The first lighter was invented in 1823, but it wasn't like the ones we have now. Not like those Bics that still don't work. It wasn't a portable thing. The first match was invented in 1805, but it kind of sucked. And the first friction-activated match came around much later in 1826. This one here changed the game for good. They were made with white phosphorus, which is of course extremely toxic. But they didn't have machines to make these matches. No, it was of course done by people, young women. It was only women that had to do this, and in the worst of conditions, of course. And before you ask, no, they didn't understand protective gear. Well, they did a bit, but even so, women didn't get that kind of luxury, right? They didn't get that treatment. These girls would have to eat their lunch at their workstations, meaning they would probably end up ingesting said white phosphorus the entire shift. History is horrible. Number 4, resurrectionalist. All right, back in the day, medical schools who wished to study the human body only really had access to the bodies of criminals who had hit the end of their line, right? You're not gonna go dig up someone's wife and be like, hey, mind if I study her? He's like, no, please. There actually weren't too many of these bodies around to begin with, which led to a good price for bodies that were in, well, reasonably good condition to, you know, study up close, other than being, you know, deceased and disgusting. This wasn't exactly the greatest idea, sure, I'll admit that. Now you've probably created an opportunity for people with no morals or empathy to go and dig up fresh graves. And that's exactly what happened. People would become their own resurrectionalist. It's a cool name for a god-awful profession, if you want to call it that. The problem was so bad that people had to protect, like they had to guard the graves of their recently deceased loved ones, or else these guys would come in and try and dig them up and sell your nana for like 20 bucks. You have to stay there for 4 nights and guard her. That's crazy. No one should have to do that. The Victorian era sucked. No one should have to do that. Or this next one here. Number 3, train engine cleaner. Yeah, this one's gonna suck. It sounds yucky already. For this job, you were required to get into, of course, pretty tough positions to, well, clean the engine of a train. Train engine cleaners would have to get inside a small hole in the engine of a train and shovel out all that coal that was left over. Yeah, as if shoveling the coal in wasn't bad enough, now some guy's gotta crawl under and shovel it all out. Nope. They go underneath the train with a dusty ash pan and they work away all day long. And nights. These guys would spend their days shoveling 5 to 6 tons of coal into the furnace of the steam trains and then spend their nights climbing into the same furnace to clean it out. Every time I watch the Polar Express, it's always so magical, you know, it's always a great time. But even on the Polar Express, there's a guy shoveling coal all night long on Christmas Eve. You know what I mean? That's how bad this job is. Magic can't even save it. Couldn't even picture a worse job to have with this goofy back. Imagine that. Imagine me doing this all day. No way. I'm gonna make it 1 week. Number 2, funeral mute. Yes, death. Happened quite a lot back then. I thought being a pallbearer had a lot of pressure, you know, don't drop them, all that kind of stuff. Victorian London saw many funeral mutes. Now, Oliver Twist, one of the lousy jobs in that tale was that of a funeral mute. Oliver Twist is like, this one sucks. Well, it really sucks. Mutes were required to dress, of course, in all black with a sash while carrying a long cloth covered stick, and your job would be to, well, to stand and mourn and not say a thing the entire time. You'd have to stand at the door of the recently deceased home and just welcome death. Just embrace it. You have to be death. The mascot for death is now you. Horrible. In Victorian London too, you're gonna breathe in a fresh rotting body. Nice, that's good. I have about 4 days left, thank you. And after that point, you would lead the coffin all the way to the graveyard. Nice and slow, like you were leading a marching band. Only it's not music, it's death behind you. And finally, number 1, a chimney sweep. I remember doing this when I was a kid. Okay, I got some questions now. I'm gonna make some phone calls after this list. I had to do this when I was a kid, but back then it was a lot worse. It wasn't a chore, it was an actual job. This was a terrible job to have in Victorian London, obviously. Chimney sweeps were famously young men, guys. I can't say anything else here, but they were young lads. That's it. History is pretty horrible, right? You could fill it in. 1840 was a good year, all things considered, because a law was passed that made it officially illegal for anyone under the age of 21 to climb in and clean a chimney. Nice. I was 18 cleaning my chimney at home. I had no idea. I could have busted out this law and been like, actually, 3 more years, Dad. See ya. Just moonwalk out of there. I'm not cleaning anything. Just the kitchen for now. I'm not using that tiny little brush. Why do all chimney sweeps have a tiny brush? Give them a bigger brush, you know?
Let's start off with the ones that you'll most likely know. For example, number 10 is MK Ultra. I feel like this is the most acknowledged on our list, but there are still plenty who don't know about MK Ultra, what it is, let alone the fact that it was real. There truly was a period of time in CIA history when they performed covert mind control experiments on civilians and soldiers alike. In the case of MK, it was during the Cold War, and the purpose was researching the ways that they could turn your everyday Joe into a CIA-controlled super agent like some unrealistic Captain America do. Unsuspecting Americans and Canadians were subjected to CIA research and secretly and unconsensually to psychedelics such as LSD and barbiturates. Additional and illegal methods of hypnosis and possibly chemical, biological, and radiological agents were also equipped on these unknowing participants. Universities participated as a delivery system, but without their knowledge. The US Department of Veterans Affairs estimated that 7,000 soldiers were also involved in the research without their consent. The project lasted some 20 years and cost about $22 million to run. While there's only one known death in relation to the project, we actually don't have the full story on MK Ultra at all. In fact, in 1973, the CIA literally destroyed records of MK Ultra when suspicions and conspiracies of its existence arose, and they spent decades gaslighting the public on this topic before unsealed documents released a few years ago 100% guaranteed its existence. Next is the Stanford prison experiment, in at number 9. We talked about this a little in our top 10 unsettling vintage photos that will leave you confused video, as photos of this experiment still circulate online and are widely discussed. You may have heard of this social psychology experiment that went awry in 1971, funding by US Office of Naval Research and headed by the university professor Philip Zimbardo. The concept was that the situation and circumstances dictate how a person acts, not their personality. It genuinely was a well-meaning idea, at least on Philip's end. He had 24 of his students assigned roles as prison guards or inmates, and some were kept aside as alternatives. It was supposed to last 2 weeks and pay $15 per day. Unfortunately, from the second the 24 were left behind closed doors to exercise the experiment, well-meaning turned disastrous, and Philip got his conclusion very quickly. Day 2, the faux prisoners had a revolt, but over the next few days they underwent awful treatment by those assigned guard roles. Some were traumatized enough to be pulled out prematurely. And on day 6, an outsider observer witnessed the upsetting events taking place and sounded the alarm, and the experiment had to be ended. Some psychologists doubt the core findings of the experiment and claim that the cruelty didn't emerge organically and was instead influenced by Zimbardo nudging the experiment in that direction. Zimbardo, however, has defended his results and stated that these criticisms criticisms are misrepresenting his study and the experiences of the people who were in it. Number 8 is Fran Retschelt's aviator suit. Arguably, he could also be dubbed the world's most confident man because he had nothing but that for his own invention, which he crafted in the early 1990s. See, Franz created a parachute using 230 square feet of fabric that would fold up into a wearable suit. Naturally, like all inventions, it needed test trials, so Franz conducted several parachute tests using test dummies, but they all failed. He always denied the invention was the one with the flaws. It was always the building being too tall, the wind vanished at the right time, the dummy was taller than last time, anything he could pin the blame on that wasn't himself. Well, in 1912 he wanted to fling another dummy off a roof, and this time he chose the Eiffel Tower. The inventor was delighted by the crowd that had gathered to see the spectacle, and they were less than delighted by what they saw that day. See, confident Franz wanted to wow the world. What happened if the first time this device worked was right now on the Eiffel Tower in front of his adoring crowd? Well, he couldn't take any chances. Franz strapped himself into the parachute suit and took the leap. Like always, the parachute didn't open, and so Franz became the victim of his own invention. But an autopsy did reveal that he died of a heart attack well before he made it to the ground. Guess he was the last dummy he threw off of a building. The Swedish cavity scandal is number 7. Called the Vipholm experiments, they were a series of human experiments that took place between 1945 and 55. Now, similar to MK Ultra, the subjects were unaware of their part in the experiment. Unlike MK Ultra, it's arguably way less harmful, but that doesn't make it better. The experiments were done on patients of Vipholm Psychiatric Hospital in Lund, Sweden, who were fed large amounts of sweets to provoke dental cavities over a 10-year duration. Sponsored by both Sweden's sugar industry and their dental associations, the effort was to determine if carbohydrates affected the formulation of cavities. It was an experiment that provided extensive knowledge on dental health and disease development. In fact, it did its goal, resulting in enough empirical data to link the intake of sugar to dental caries and cavities. However, the Swedish government recognizes the violation of medical ethics principles and formally and publicly apologized for its actions. Cloudbusters is number 6, and nothing can prepare you for how weird this is. So, the psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich somehow managed to connect the dots between intercourse, weather, and an alien invasion. Of course, he was influenced by Sigmund Freud, and Reich extended Freud's work on human libido into the proposition of an unheard of energy called orgone. Orgone apparently was responsible for everything, from the weather to why the sky is blue. To give you an idea of how scientifically sound Reich's concept was, orgone has been compared to the Force in Star Wars. Apparently, he believed a discharge of orgone energy happened when climax was achieved via intercourse, and through the manipulation of this energy, you could treat neuroses and even cancer. So in the 1950s, Reich ups the levels and becomes convinced aliens are spraying the earth with radiation to prevent us from using the powerful orgone energy. So he and his son built Cloudbusters, a row of tubes attached to hoses that were immersed in water aimed up at the sky. Apparently, the water would absorb the radiation. Well, the FDA said, "What the hell is that?" and they ordered this machine destroyed, as well as any other apparatus he made. When he tried to smuggle them out of the state, the FDA saw him arrested. Number 5 sounds relaxing. It's a year in bed, except it wasn't relaxing at all. Cosmonaut, which is fancy talk for astronaut in Russia, Boris Morukov wanted to examine the effects of weightlessness on the human body. So in exchange for a car, if you succeeded in the experiment, in 1986 Boris found 11 suitable volunteers, which he made lie in bed for 370 days without ever getting up. Every subject was to remain in a sleeping position, aka fetal position, and perform everyday activities that way. This was eating, watching TV, working, or washing. They had to stay as they were. He chose this particular position as it was the closest to the sensation of weightlessness that is felt in space. The point is to simulate the effects of microgravity on the human body, and those effects are terrible in the long run. Loss of muscle and bone, loss of function of internal organs, including the heart slowing as it doesn't have to push blood up against the force of gravity, and having trouble digesting. After about 4 months, muscle clenching exercises or walking on a vertical treadmill placed at the foot of the bed was allowed. The idea was to see if the well-known deterioration of the body could be countered by these exercises. It couldn't. No ill will went towards Boris though. He interacted regularly with the people involved, and some even gave him little gifts made out of their provided craft supplies. Even after the experiment, when participants had to spend 2 months regaining their ability to walk, no bitterness was held. But at least everybody got a car! Operation Midnight Climax is number 4, and it sounds like the name of a DVD that'd be behind the XXX curtain at an old Blockbuster. In reality, it was a 1950s CIA mind control research scheme. Lesser known than MK Ultra, it was actually more tactical in its execution. So the CIA paid ladies of the night to lure everyday, non-consenting San Fran and New York citizens into safe houses disguised as cheap motels. They were slipped substances such as L and IDP without their knowledge, and then monitored by the CIA through one-way glass. Oh yeah, this is some real dystopian movie energy here. Since this project wasn't to make super soldiers like MK, its purpose was purely educational for the government, investigating how substance affected different people and intervening if they felt something could go astray. Because of their subtly and well-plotted scheme, they operated for a full decade using red light districts, and Operation Midnight Climax actually provided the government with extensive knowledge on psychedelics, surveillance technology, and tactics, and even blackmail. Fortunately for those unwitting test subjects, Operation Midnight Climax was shut down in 1965. Number 3, we learn about the Dr. Fox effect. This tricky little experiment educates us on social cues and expectations, and how we shouldn't always be fooled by them. This was done to test if content that's well presented and polished, no matter how incorrect, can fool experts because of who or how it's presented by. This original experiment was performed at the University of Southern California School of Medicine in 1970 during an annual conference. The topic, mathematical game theory as applied to physician education, was chosen to eliminate any chances of the students being lectured would know something about the actual subject. The students were then split into 2 groups, one with real mathematician Dr. Myron Fox, and the others with actor imposter of him, who was ironically named Mr. Michael Fox. In the first half of the study, Mr. Fox taught his material in a monotone voice. This lecture was then compared to the monotone lecture of Dr. Fox. The students who attended the lecture taught by Dr. Fox had learned material and performed better on an examination. Those led by Mr. Fox were confused and lost. However, when both the actor and the mathologist had presented their material in an engaging, expressive, and enthusiastic manner, the students rated Dr. Fox as equal to the real professor, even though he had absolutely no idea what game theory was. This lack of correlation between content coverage and ratings resulted from conditions of strong expressiveness became known as the Dr. Fox effect. Number 2 is yellow fever experiment, and it's just illogical and gross, so I can understand not being taught this one, especially because it's pointless in the end. Stubbins Firth was a 19th century medical student who absolutely was sold on yellow fever not being a contagious disease. So to prove it, he decided to expose himself in every way possible. In his experiments, Firth cooked vomit of yellow fever patients on his stove and inhaled the vapors. He put vomit eye drops in his eyes, an incision in his left arm, he put some in there, and he even put yellow fever patient blood into his veins. Despite the extremely contagious nature of yellow fever, Firth never got sick. Eventually, he was literally taking shots of black vomit, which he described as tasting slightly acidic. So how did Firth not contract yellow fever despite doing his best to? Well, we know now it's because it's spread through mosquito bites, but it also is spread human to human through blood contamination, and Firth was contaminating his blood, so what gives? Theories are maybe he had contracted the disease young in life and survived with an immunity, or maybe he just had a natural immunity. It's possible that his samples were virus-free somehow, but we'll never know. Either way, if you're chugging vomit and cutting open your arms to introduce a potentially lethal virus, it's fair to say something else is wrong. And finally, number 1 is the Good Samaritan experiment. This experiment revolved around the bystander effect, coined by the killing of Kitty Genovese, wherein over 20 people witnessed it and no one stepped in to save her life. Many studies have been done over time since this tragedy to understand human reaction to suffering. In a 1968 experiment, test subjects were put in a room with an actor who pretended to have a seizure. The study then found that when a group of subjects witnessed the seizure, few people stepped forward to help, but subjects who were alone in the room with the actor, however, were willing to step up more quickly. So, Princeton Good Samaritan experiment of 1973 followed in the footsteps of past experiments, seeking to test how willing people are to do a good deed. The experiment involved inviting 40 students to give a speech on what it means to be a good Samaritan. On each participant's way to the speech, they were watched by surveillance. Unbeknownst to the participants, the researchers had assigned them to one of 3 groups. Some participants were told that if they left immediately, they would be early. Others were told that they would be on time, and the remainder were told that they were already late. An actor was put in their path to feign severe distress and pain. Some were assigned extreme emergencies, such as someone having a faux heart attack. It's a shock to how many that there were fewer than 50% of students that stopped to help the actor, and less than 10% stopped for an extreme emergency. Reminder, these students were unwilling to help even though they were on their way to give a speech on the benefits of being a good Samaritan. Students who were studying to become religious leaders as part of their religious majors. It's believed that the participants only ignored the stranger because arriving to give their their speech on time would help the experimenters. Conflicting obligations rather than cruelty could explain low helping numbers in high hurrying situations. Take this as a reminder to check in on strangers around you who may be distressed. Whether homeless or everyday, you never know whose life could change with a little humanity. Number 10 is suspicious hygiene. Well, at least it was suspicious to others. But to the Scandinavians and their Vikings, it was actually incredibly common and important. They had a weekly regimen for their cleaning their bodies or the cleaning of their clothes. This is where the unsettling part does come in though. See, in traditional Nordic beliefs, it is suggested that since you never knew the day of your death, you should always look your best for the inevitable arrival in the afterlife. This is because when you die, you will be in the presence of your gods and any soul that has departed before you. So, by dressing and grooming yourself daily in a clean manner, you ensure that you would not have to be ashamed. And it also had cosmic significance in maintaining order and staving off the cataclysm of Ragnarok, which would end the world. So to break that down, they were hygienic because however they died is how they would meet their gods, looking like that, and also it would help prevent an apocalypse. Okay, so the Viking reputation for being well groomed comes from Christian accounts condemning such behavior as vain and posturing, which seduced Christians into emulating their evil pagan ways, and doing so angered the Christian god. In reality, chroniclers were just pissed that the Vikings were kicking their asses and stealing their women. A famous example of this resentment towards Viking superiority and, well, hygiene is after some Vikings did a sacking of a monastery in 793. Scholar Alcuin wrote multiple letters to English kings denouncing those Christians who had begun dressing and caring for themselves as the pagan Vikings did, since this obviously incurred God's wrath. What you give is whatever you get with number 9, blot sacrifices. The concept of this ritual is an exchange. By sacrificing to the gods with certain items or certain requests, the Vikings could receive something in return. Sometimes it would be a request for fertility or goodwill regarding the weather or the harvest. Sometimes it was luck in battle. It's believed that there are 4 of these blots that were done during the year at the time of the autumn and spring equinox and the summer and winter solstices. One of the few documented blots in history is documented by Icelander named Snorri in the early 1200s, who described how all the farmers of the area had gathered at the temple to make sacrifice, and a meal was provided by Sigurd Hakansson, a generous man of wealth. Multiple animals were sacrificed, primarily horses, and the blood was collected all in bowls, being that the participants used twigs to splatter the blood along the stone altars, walls, and the participants themselves. Then they cooked the meat via boiling in cauldrons and blessed it by a god's priest, and then some was eaten by all in attendance. Beer was also blessed, then consumed with it. They would make a toast to Odin and decree to the king and victory before emptying cups for Njord and Frey to secure a prosperous and peaceful future. After all was done, they made final toasts to their kin who had now been resting in burial mounds. Number 8 is worshipping whites. So Nordic history is sadly lost because of how Christianity colonized the country. When they invaded, they didn't just erase history, they actually buried it. So cultural hubs and temples were made of wood and they were torn down and burned on the spot. Then on their exact foundations, new wooden churches were built. Those were later torn down or fell from natural elements, and new stone churches were built on those foundations. When those crumbled, they buried history even further beneath the foundation. During this Christianization, the missionaries were more focused on suppressing the belief of named gods like Thor, Odin, Frigga, you get the idea. But smaller collectives of deities got to continue on without awareness of Christian authorities for a little. This is why we have some paper documentation of the worship of whites. Whites were protective deities on areas of land, and there were many religious rules for how to deal with them to avoid conflicts. It's debated what whites are fully. Some say they are undead ghosts or they're nature spirits. What's agreed upon is their claim as land protectors. They are tied to the landscape, often to a certain rock or a mountain or even a valley itself. When Egil Skallagrimson was driven from Norway to exile in Iceland, he decided to piss off some rights in revenge. He erected a knitting pool on white land to frighten and enrage them, bringing all of Norway bad luck. It's said Iceland is protected by 4 of these whites, and they have taken the form of a bull, eagle, dragon, and giant that will kill or decimate any invaders attempting to approach. They are depicted on Iceland's coat of arms. Piss or get off the pot is number 7. Like the ancient Greeks, the Vikings also had a portable and creative fire that they equipped towards enemies. Unlike Greek fire, which still remains unexplained, we figured this one out, and I'm sure you can guess what it is from the title. I have no idea what they were doing or trying to accomplish, but when Vikings boiled a bunch of urine with a piece of tree bark fungus called touchwood together for days on end, that fungus could then be pounded flat into a strip of like felt material. Then these pieces of material could be ignited and literally tossed around. Again, no idea how they came across this combination or why they were boiling it in the first place. All we know is that this is what they figured out. Anyways, these urine saturated strips were flammable due to the sodium nitrate in urine. Paired with the spores in the mold, they created a smolder effect instead of an inferno. So they were quite convenient for setting campfires or portable fuel for cooking rigs. Either way, the Vikings carried piss grenades, and I think that's pretty wild. Number 6 makes me cringe. It's tooth modification. As aforementioned, Vikings cared a lot about their appearances, bleaching hair, combing beards, herbs in the armpits, ironing clothes with rocks, and apparently modifying their teeth. What do I mean by modification? Well, prepare to flinch like crazy because archaeologists have found multiple Viking skulls where there are intentional shape changes to teeth or grooves, dots, and other patterns carved into them. It's primarily been the top front teeth, and researchers believe that the grooves were filled with dyes like reds and purples. Due to the Christianization I previously described, there are no records explaining this practice, and it's unknown to us until we even discovered these skulls with modifications. There is some assumption that maybe it was earned or associated with a level of status, perhaps even used by warriors to incite fear in their opposition. What we do know is this practice was not seen anywhere else in the Caucasus and European regions at that time, and further information just remains lost. Gather around the Yule log for number 5. Yule itself. That fun little YouTube video a lot of people put on their TV whilst opening presents Christmas morning is actually its own holiday. Yule is a period between winter solstice and the blot ritual done for that solstice. It's speculated to be somewhere around January 12th each year. The reason it's celebrated, once again, is lost to history, but speculation is that it honors the dead, the new year, and to celebrate Thor and the coming sunlight he brought as days become longer. We know that there's a multi-day feast and alcohol paired with singing and games. Vikings would make a sun wheel that they would set on fire and roll down a hill in honor of the sun's return. Sounding like a party to me. Naturally, they made Yule logs decorated with yews, hollies, and firs alongside carved runes. A piece of this Yule was kept every year until the next Yule to protect the family and be the start of the first fire of next year. Yule is actually the basis for most Christmas traditions. The Yule log, decorating a Christmas tree, ornaments, caroling, making cookies, so much more. This is actually because when Christianity was forcing its way in, they needed to up conversion, but no one was interested in monotheism. So they created Christmas, and they used the Yule traditions as a basis in order to convince people to convert. They also took St. Nicholas and the concept of stockings, which were boots originally, from Eastern Europe and the Balkan region to convert them. Clever Christians used people's pre-existing cultures under a new name to have them join them for a lot of different things. What they didn't take, however, was the unsettling detail that every 9th year of Yule, it was customary for Swedish kings to sacrifice men at the temple of Uppsala. 9 heads would be offered to the gods, with the bodies hanging out of the temple's sacred grove. This would go on for 9 days, totaling 81 sacrifices that would be accompanied by feasts and Yule festivities. Number 4 is Zombie Avoidance 101. A suspicious amount of cultures speak of the undead creatures rising at night to torment the living that can't enter a door without being invited. It makes you wonder what they saw that we didn't. Called Draugr, Scans and Vikings lived on the assumption once any corpse was buried, it would become animated again. If it were peaceful, then it was called a hogboy, and it would innocently reside in its grave to protect it from robbers. However, when they weren't peaceful, they were Draugr, wandering away from its burrow to harm any human it could find. Precautions to avoid this included pieces of straw placed in cross formations under the burial shroud, a pair of open scissors placed across the chest, the big toes tied together, and even nails poked into the bottom of feet to make walking out impossible. Even how the coffin bearers would stop before leaving with the coffin, raising it 3 times in different directions, would symbolize a cross. Since Vikings believed the dead could only return the same way that they came, it was believed that the deceased wouldn't be able to enter a house without invitation, and a body carried out feet first wouldn't properly see the route back from its burial mound. Once the deceased was out those doors, any jars, saucepans, cauldrons, chairs, clothes, anything used by the deceased that others would later be using was turned upside down. Number 3 is the baby trials, and yeah, I literally mean a baby going through trials. Like, don't get me wrong, it's not the Olympics, the baby didn't have to like throw a spear or man a Viking ship, but they did have to be accepted and acknowledged as a real person. Norse didn't consider babies as humans the second they're born. This may seem strange to us now, but that mentality likely spared immeasurable grief as natural mortality was so high. By having emotional distance, parents were able to protect themselves, an important perspective to remember. With a happy, healthy, and alive baby, the Norse went through a few rituals to humanize it. First, the baby was sat on the ground until the father picked up the child and placed him inside his coat or cloak. This symbolized the father accepted that the baby was his child. Next, they inspected the child to ensure it it was healthy. Blindness or deafness wasn't attested, by the way. After those two acceptances, the ceremony of Osavatni occurred and they sprinkled fresh water on the baby. The last step was Nafnesti, a naming ritual. The father would state the child's name and bestow a gift, usually things like a ring, farmland, weapon, or even deer. This final acceptance made the baby officially a person, and any offense towards it would be penalized as if the baby was an adult. Number 2 is all kinds of ghastly, the blood eagle. The TV show Vikings brought this torture method to widespread attention. You've likely also seen it in TV show NBC Hannibal or the horror movie Midsommar, a Scandinavian-based film. It's a method of execution that could last hours and sometimes days, and it was rumored to have killed King Alea in 867 AD. The punished was laid face down, restrained with his arms and legs spread, and an eagle was carved into the skin of his back before the skin was peeled back and ribs separated from the spinal cord with an axe. But we aren't done yet. The ribs and muscles are then pulled outwards to represent the wings of an eagle, and of course, salt was then pressed and rubbed into the wound. While the victim is still alive, his lungs are gently lifted out of the body to rest on the stretched out rib bones. As the victim died, his last breaths and the wind amongst him would make the lungs flutter like that of a bird's wing. Jesus, I don't even know how to follow that up with a witty comment, man. I think I'm gonna just move on to the next segment. So number 1 is somehow more grotesque. It's the berserkers. We all know Vikings were absolute beasts in battle, so you had to know this list was gonna get a little darker towards the end. They had this thing called battle fury, which in recent times we have theorized to be the result of either intentional or accidental use of psychedelic and fungus. This could cause a self-induced hypnotic trance, resulting in them losing their sense of pain and conscious control of their movements. But nothing was more terrifying than a berserker. They took that battle fury and multiplied it by 100. They took on the appearance and behavior of either a bear or a wolf, even donning the pelt or the heads of their chosen animal. Oftentimes, that's the only garb they wore at all. Apparently, to reach this status, they lived out in the wild like their totem animal. Being stripped of humanity allowed them to take on the strength and mindset of that creature. So when they fought in battle, berserkers apparently used just their bare hands and teeth. And according to legend, they felt no pain and could keep fighting for hours despite any injury. They were said to have even ripped man limb from limb. Imagine going into battle in like 600 AD with an opposing army you've never seen before, and then it turns out it's a bunch of 6'11" dudes in animal skins out of their minds on psychedelics and carrying 7-foot swords. Yeah.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Pope Gregory IX. Pope Gregory IX was the Bishop of Rome and the ruler of the Papal States from 1227 until his passing in 1241. The Papal States were a series of territories in the Italian peninsula that were under direct rule of the Pope from the 8th century all the way to 1870. It turns out that Pope Gregory IX had a very strange hatred for cats. He said that black cats were actually instruments of Satan, which seems a little extreme, but then he actually went as far as to order that they be exterminated throughout Europe, which is definitely a little extreme. With this order, the Pope's followers had to oblige, and there was a drastic reduction in the cat population. But of course, this caused a disturbance to the ecosystem, and the time and the consequence of that became very evident. Because of the decline of cats, there was a sudden increase in the amount of rats, most of which may have been carrying the plague. There are a lot of historians who would argue that this war on cats may have had a huge effect on the severity of the Black Plague. That is of course speculation, as it's pretty difficult to pinpoint who could be at fault for something like that, but it certainly is a very interesting point. This all really does, however, bring me to my next point. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Black Death. I'm sure we've all heard of the Black Death at some point or another. I mean, how could we possibly ever stop talking about something like that? During the 1340s, there was an outbreak of the bubonic plague that spread rapidly throughout Europe and Asia. It was called the Black Plague because of the fact that this illness would cause people's lymph nodes to become swollen and black. The Black Death was absolutely terrible, and it caused a lot of agony for those who had to go through it. Symptoms included things like severe body aches, fever, vomiting, and eventual death in most cases. There was no cure for the plague, so it just continued to spread. In the end, the Black Death took the lives of hundreds of millions of people. We now all know firsthand what it is like to live through a pandemic, and I certainly wouldn't sign up to do it again anytime soon, so I'm most definitely sure the times of the Black Death were some of the worst times in history. Apparently, it is said that if you lived in the 1340s, there was basically a 50-50 chance that you'd survive the Black Death. And then on top of that, there's all of the other horrifying ways to die that the medieval times held. All in all, I'm kinda shocked that we're still here today. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Mongol invasion. Being in China during the Mongol invasion certainly was a terrifying time. I'm sure a lot of us here have heard at least some of the stories surrounding Genghis Khan, but if you haven't, let's just say that being on his bad side certainly wasn't a good thing for you. In 1205, when the Mongol invasion in China began, it was the regular citizens of China who paid the ultimate price. What was started by Genghis Khan was carried on by his son and then his grandson, which ultimately led to a 74-year-long campaign that was filled with brutality and destruction. Cities and towns were destroyed, empires were brought down, and millions of completely innocent people lost their lives. It is believed that this invasion took the lives of enough people to cut the population in half from 120 million before to just 60 million after. Anyone living in China at this time would have had to live in absolute fear of being killed for something that you really had nothing to do with. That would be awful and absolutely terrifying. In our number 7 spot today, we have Pope Formosus and Pope Stephen VI. Pope Formosus was the ruler of the Papal States from October 6, 891 until he passed away on April 4, 896. After his passing, Pope Boniface VI took his place as ruler for just a few weeks before he also passed away, which then left Pope Stephen VI as the ruler from then on until his death. After this whirlwind April of 1896, things got even weirder. Before his passing, Pope Formosus had sided with Arnulf of Carinthia against Lambert of Spoleto, which was definitely not okay with Pope Stephen VI. So, once Pope Stephen VI gets to the place of being the ruler, he gets the people to exhume the body of Pope Formosus so that he can put him on trial. I feel like this is very gross and very unnecessary, but this really is the type of stuff that went on in the 800s. They propped the body up for trial and had a deacon answer questions for him since he obviously was unable to do that himself. They ended up finding the corpse guilty, which seems a little unfair, and they actually went as far as to strip the body of its sacred vestments, took 3 fingers from the right hand as they were the blessing fingers. They dressed the body in regular people clothes instead of the clothing a pope would be buried in, and then they reburied the body. If this poor man's body hadn't been through enough, it was later re-exhumed again and thrown into the river. If this story wasn't already wild enough, this whole debacle is actually what would later end up getting Pope Stephen imprisoned and then killed. Alright, so I guess the other pope had his justice in the end. I don't know, man. In our number 6 spot today, we have King Charles VI. King Charles VI started off his reign by being very well loved and respected, but as time went on over his 4 decades of ruling, he ended up being known as Charles the Mad. His erratic behavior had him hacking up nights, imagining that he was St. George, and he would also have bouts of amnesia where he would be able to recognize some people, but not his wife and children. This is all very strange and of course quite sad, as he was obviously exhibiting signs of extreme mental illness, but one of the strangest symptoms was him believing that he was made of glass. He was terribly frightened of falling or being jostled too hard, and he would actually insert iron rods into his clothing to try and keep himself from shattering. But then he would also apparently run wild at top speeds throughout the halls of the castle or the streets, which would obviously mean that he was completely abandoning his fear of fragility. It apparently got so bad that he had to be held inside with the entrances blocked off. Sadly, he continued on this path until he passed away in 1422. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Italian Renaissance dark side. Just at the tail end of the years of the medieval period, as we transitioned into the Renaissance period, began the Italian Renaissance. When we think of the Italian Renaissance period, it is known for the development and the rebirth that it caused, which makes a lot of sense considering the word Renaissance means rebirth. But there is one less glamorous and slightly frightening side to this period that isn't always spoken about. Sailors who had been returning from the New World at this point brought something less than lovely back with them, and that was syphilis, which spread through an entire French army. After this, the troops brought what was called the Great Pox to the rest of Europe. Since there was no penicillin back then, the disease spread rapidly and the symptoms were pretty gruesome. It would often happen that the person who had fallen ill would have the skin on their faces essentially be rotting away, which would leave large ulcers. Sometimes people's noses or lips would be pretty much gone, and it happened often that people would very sadly pass away from the disease. So basically, what we think of as a really beautiful time in Europe was both world-changing but also very scary and, like, I don't know, kinda close to a zombie apocalypse. In our number 4 spot today, we have William the Conqueror. In 1087, William the Conqueror decided to take on an all-alcohol diet. This is because he was suffering from extreme obesity and was struggling because of that fact. Because of this, he told his staff that he would only drink wine until his weight went down, but he ended up passing away less than a year later, and most of us are told that obviously this was because of the wine-only diet. That's actually not true. In an astonishing turn of events, this wine-only diet actually worked. Shortly after beginning his diet, he was able to ride his horse again, which was one of the main reasons he started the diet in the first place, as he was previously too heavy for the horse to carry. He actually died after falling from his horse during an expedition, which was completely unrelated to either his weight or his diet. It's entirely possible that had he not gone on this diet, he would have never ridden his horse and maybe would have lived longer? Truthfully, who knows? But I suppose in a very roundabout way, he did still kind of die from his wine-only diet. In our number 3 spot today, we have Olga of Kiev. Olga of Kiev became queen regent in 945 CE after her husband was killed, and during the time her son was too young to rule just yet. Olga knew that once her son was old enough to be crowned king, her power would be taken away, so she needed to see her wishes carried out before that happened. Her wishes included the capturing and killing of those who took the life of her husband, which was carried out by using scalding hot water. Yeah. Don't even want to imagine what that would have been like. Don't kill the king, I guess. Historically, it really doesn't seem to work out well. Apparently, in doing this, however, Olga developed a bit of a bloodthirst, and she would not rest until everyone associated with the people who killed her husband were all eliminated. It seemed like if you even looked in the wrong direction or breathed in the vicinity of someone who had something to do with the king's slaying, you could kiss your own life goodbye. Olga took hundreds of people out of the tribe that the killers were from. She devised a plan to bury the tribe leaders alive, and she even came up with a plan to set fire to their entire village. It is said that Olga may have locked the tribe's leaders in a bathhouse and burned it down, but we don't know for sure. All we do know is that she definitely was not okay. In our number 2 spot today, we have Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was a deputy to the ruler of the Mali Empire, but when the ruler went missing while on a sea voyage to find the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, Mansa Musa became the ruler in 1312. During his rule, European nations were really struggling due to civil wars and a lack of resources, but the Mali Empire was flourishing because of their abundance of resources like gold and salt. Under his rule, the empire grew to take up a large portion of West Africa as he conquered 24 cities and their surrounding districts. At this time, Mali was one of the top producers of gold in the entire world, which left Mansa Musa as one of the wealthiest historical figures ever. One of the most well-known events during his rule was the pilgrimage to Mecca. This journey took place from 1324 to 1325 and spanned an estimated 4,000 miles, and it was the first time people outside of the empire saw just how wealthy he was. He traveled with 60,000 of his men, all wearing Persian silk, along with 12,000 slaves who each carried 4 pounds of gold bars, and he also brought heralds who had golden staffs, along with a bunch of camels and horses. This pilgrimage had a profound effect on Egypt as this huge group of people passed through. From the markets in Cairo to the royals to the impoverished people that crossed their path, Musa left Cairo littered with so much gold that it depreciated the value of the metal in Egypt, and it took decades for them to recover. In our number 1 spot today, we have St. Marcellus's flood. This was actually a very serious extratropical cyclone that swept through around January 16th, 1362. This cyclone eerily matched up with the new moon, and it spanned through the British Isles, the Netherlands, northern Germany, and Denmark. Here's the thing, this storm not only lined up with the moon, but also peaked on the feast day of St. Marcellus, which is the reason it got its name, but usually people refer to this one as the second because there is another. The first St. Marcellus flood took the lives of 36,000 people as it swept through the northern Netherlands in 1219. The second flood, however, while no one is sure the exact numbers, it is estimated that at least 250,000 people lost their lives. While there have been plenty of devastating floods in history, this one is said to be blamed on Atlantic gales, and that this event goes hand in hand with the Great Wind of 1362.
Kicking off our list at number 10, the Pioneers' Defense. Right off the bat, yeah, look at this one. I don't have to explain why it's creepy in any way. A whole town appears to be wearing gas masks. Yeah, you could probably guess which era this is. This image was captured in 1937 by Russian photographer Viktor Bula. Adapting to new safety regulations Americans, these last few years have been challenging, no doubt about that. But in 1937, if you wanted to join the Young Pioneers, which is the Soviet version of the Boy Scouts, well, you had to wear these huge gas masks and part of military preparation. Yeah, welcome to Boy Scouts. Grab a button and then put this vacuum cleaner on your face. Enjoy. Break a leg. It's gonna hurt your back a bit. This photo is haunting. It's from the Leningrad area, and it happened while dictator Stalin was still in charge. These masks are so haunting to look at. We see them after the fact, but to see them being worn in real time in that photo, I don't know. Maybe this photo gets me because we can't see anybody's faces or ages, right? Makes you paint the picture yourself. Either way, let's move on to some clown stuff, shall we? Number 9, 1910 clowns. Yeah, they existed back then, and they were much worse. Here's a fun fact, I didn't know this, but back in 2016, a study was done, and it turns out Americans fear clowns more than they fear death. Mind you, this was at the height of the clown craze back in America, but a poll was conducted by the Morning Consult in 2016, and it shows that 42% of Americans said they were in some capacity afraid of clowns. 42%. So if this is you, you may want to skip to the next one. I'll beat you there, no problem. This photo is from 1910, and it appears to be a jolly good time, right? 2 clowns for the price of 1. Nice, what a great deal. Let's go. Now what's terrifying about this photo, I'll admit, is that the clown on the right is much larger than the clown on the left. If you have a fear of giants, well, you're screwed here, really. Nowhere you can go. Just a tall clown and a little clown. There's clowns everywhere. I don't like clowns. Number 8, Annalise Michel. If you've seen or heard of the 2005 horror film, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, this one here should ring a bell. This is the OG photo. How scary is that? Annalise Michel was a devout Catholic living a normal life with her parents in Germany. This was back in the late 1960s, but seemingly out of nowhere, she began to black out before showing strange behaviors. And when I say strange behaviors, I mean she would hallucinate and eat spiders. Stuff like that. Yeah, it was pretty scary. It was also extremely unhealthy, but ultimately Annalise claimed to be possessed by the devil, and her parents soon had to agree. Cut to 67 exorcisms later, Annalise sadly died of malnutrition at age 23 in 1976. And like I mentioned at the start of this point, her story was so widely known and shocking that it eventually inspired the 2005 horror film, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which I have seen, and it is very scary. All real. Turns out. Sleep in fear. Number 7, the fire. This is a photo that comes to us from 2003. Not quite vintage, but still old enough. I'm 28. Yeah, where's time going? I don't know. This one came from the Station nightclub back in Rhode Island, and it shows the band Great White as they perform. Now, while this may seem like just a regular photo that somebody took on their Motorola Razr, what ensued shortly after this photo was taken is absolutely horrifying and tragic. Basically, as the band performed, there were some pyrotechnics that were set off, and they were meant to be a spectacular display, but they only ended up coming out as a disaster. See, the fireworks ended up setting all of the flammable acoustic foam in the walls and the ceiling all around them on fire. And it happened fast too, within 1 minute. Everything that was combustible ended up going in flames fast. Within 2 minutes, the entire club was fully engulfed in black smoke and people were having trouble finding exits. It was crowded, right? In the end, this fire took the lives of 100 people and another 230 were injured as a result. It has since gone down in US history as one of the worst and most deadly nightclub fires. Yeah, we look at Ball of Burning Men and think of what happened there. This is basically a 2003 version of that. More people, more flammable stuff, more pyrotechnics, and unfortunately, more deaths. Number 6, the Titanic. We all know the story of the Titanic. I mean, Olivia hasn't seen the movie, but we'll get to that later. It's one of the most famous in history, and this photo comes from just before that historic iceberg encounter. On April 10th, 1912, the Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage, heading from Southampton over to New York City. Now, the ship took a couple stops along the way, one in France and the other in Ireland, before setting off ultimately for the United States officially. Now, somewhere along the beginning part of its journey, somebody was able to snap a photo of the ship as it sailed away. Now, it's not clear exactly where this photo was taken because it's old and there's a lot of water, but it is thought to be the last photo of the ship ever before its tragic end. Considering it was only 4 days after the ship set sail that it hit the iceberg, it is likely that this photo came not too long before that terrible day. So yeah, they're probably right. This was probably the last photo. Number 5, Oroville Dam. On February 13th, 2017 in Oroville, California, the Oroville Dam, which is the tallest dam in the United States that holds back a reservoir that contains 1.1 trillion gallons of water, well, that dam's main emergency spillways were damaged. This led to the emergency evacuation of 188,000 people people over concerns that the damage's emergency spillway might just fail at this point. This was all caused by torrential rain and floods in the region, which then began to reveal the extensive damage in said spillway. This photo here shows the dam releasing 100,000 cubic feet of water per second into the main spillway. This is a feat of engineering, if anything. Now, luckily, a major disaster was avoided in the situation because of quick action by those responsible, but to see it unfold and to see how fierce it is, I don't like water, or pressure, or dams, or history. Let's move on. Number 4, the lipstick killer. This is a photo that comes to us from December 10th, 1945. Now, if looking at this image gives you a weird shudder or chill down your spine, you got instincts. Nice. You've heard about this in some way, or yeah, you read the title. You know it's some bad stuff coming. This was written by a terrible person known as the lipstick killer. This photo is an image of a note that he left written on the wall at one of his crime scenes. Now, the photo comes from the apartment of Frances Brown, as just before he wrote this message, he, as you would have guessed, took her life, sadly. After this message was left, he ended up taking the life of another person because he was finally caught by police 6 months later. The message, put in the photo, reads, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." Yeah, the lipstick killer wrote that. It's the scariest thing I ever heard. It's an absolute chilling note with a horrifying backstory. A lot of killers are getting their Netflix specials now, so I'm sure it's only time before he gets one. Number 3, eruption of Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens is a stratovolcano located in Washington. Now, the volcano is best known, of course, for its huge and disastrous eruption on May 18th, 1980. And we have a photograph of it, and it's very scary. This photograph comes from photographer Robert Landsberg, who of course was unfortunately in the area at the time of the eruption. Now, before the eruption, he had visited the area in order to photograph and document all the changes that were happening. Didn't expect this one. On May 18th, he was within a few miles of the volcano when it did erupt. Now, since he unfortunately was located so close to the eruption, he knew he wouldn't be able to escape this disaster. So instead of focusing on the impossible, he focused on taking as many photos as possible. Just like a historian at the end of his life, really. Robert was obviously incredibly brave and dedicated, and also very smart. After snapping as many photos as he could, including this one, he then secured his camera in his backpack and covered his backpack with his body. Protected history. It's like he knew he was unlikely to survive, but he still wanted to make sure that these photos did. That's why it was so important for me to bring it in this list today. His body was found 17 days later with his backpack still underneath him. Plan did work, and his film was of course developed and has provided geologists with some really valuable insights with his close documentation of the eruption. So historically, it's a feat, but also scientifically, it's one as well. Number 2, acid drum. This photo comes to us from the inside of the house of, well, you guessed it, another terrible person. The serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Yeah, we all know him. This photo was taken from the inside of his home right after he was found and caught by authorities. Now, before his arrest, he was sadly able to take the lives of 17 individuals. Now, although this photo may look kind of plain, dare I say, the horrors behind it are plentiful. This shot is simple. It shows a drum full of acid that was located inside of his home. You can only imagine the horrors. I don't need to tell you what this was used for, obviously. And I can't imagine the horrors that investigators saw when they first arrived to his house. Even investigating the crimes is one thing, but to show up and see this, it's too much. Thankfully, Jeffrey was caught, and in 1992, he was sentenced to life in prison, but just 2 years later, he was killed by a fellow prison inmate. Insert Curb Your Enthusiasm music. And finally, number 1, Europe flood. This photo comes to us from the summer of 2022, as people across Western Europe experienced disastrous flooding. Now, after days of heavy raining, it ended up turning rivers that were usually normal and calm into these raging currents that ravaged the streets, and sadly left cars and power lines just being swept away. Homes too, they got engulfed and residents were trapped inside. This photo was taken in Erfstadt, which is just southwest of Cologne, and it shows how a bunch of houses collapsed due to subsidence, which is the sudden sinking of the ground surface below. Now, unfortunately, these floods caused many people to lose their lives, mostly in Germany, but these were sadly dozens of people in Belgium as well, pretty much everywhere. Bigger than we thought initially, all which was an absolute tragedy. Rescue workers worked tirelessly to help as many people as possible escape this terrible situation. I couldn't even imagine responding to this, let alone being caught up in it. It's terrible.